I remember when a mysterious package showed up on our doorstep, and my wife and I went and looked, and there was a package that was just wrapped up in brown paper with tape all around it, and we had no idea who it had come from, where it had come from. We couldn't read anything that was on it. It was all in a different language. The only thing we could see was that it was addressed to us. So we took this package and we began ripping all the tape and paper off, and what we found in the middle was a knife. We had no idea who this knife had come from, where it had even come from, and all of a sudden we start asking questions like, are we being framed for something? Like, was this a murder weapon? Are the FBI going to kick down our door and find the murder weapon at our house? And so we're talking about this, and my wife calls her father and started saying, this mysterious knife showed up on our doorstep. We have no idea where it's from. And her mom overhears the conversation and says, I sent that knife. You had mentioned that you didn't have a good kitchen knife, and so this one is great. They actually mailed it straight from Taiwan. And it's this great knife, and I sent it to you because I love you guys. Well, all of a sudden, things made a little bit more sense. You know, when we started with the knife, we had to fill in the details of what we didn't know about the rest of the story. But when we started with the sender, all of a sudden, that knife made sense. It was a gift for a purpose sent by somebody who loved us. Now, you can't understand a story if you start right in the middle. Our tendency is to start our story with ourselves. But the Bible never starts with us. The Bible starts with God. Genesis 1, chapter 1 says, in the beginning, God. John chapter 1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. What we see in Scripture is that the story of creation starts with God. And so if we start our story with ourselves, we're starting not at the beginning, and we'll never understand our story if we start in the middle. There's something within us that longs to know what is beyond us. Blaise Pascal once said that there's this God-shaped void within us. There's something within us that longs to know what is out there beyond us in order to understand ourselves. And there's a great passage in Exodus chapter 3 where Moses is in the middle of the desert and he's off with his flock, and all of a sudden he sees a burning bush, and he turns aside to go and see what's going on with this burning bush. And when he does, he encounters God. And God tells him that he is the God of his ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's telling Moses, I've been around for a long time. I predate you, Moses. I was the God of your fathers and their fathers before them. And when he gives Moses the assignment to go back to Egypt, Moses says, well, who will I tell them sent me? Essentially, he's asking, who are you, God? And God says, I am who I am. He doesn't allow Moses to define who he is. He defines himself for Moses. He says, I am who I am. You can't compare me to other things. I have always existed. I am the starting point of the story. And everything else makes sense in relation to me. And from that point, it changes everything for Moses. Moses understood himself as a fugitive from Egypt, now as a shepherd on the backside of the desert. But when he encountered God and began to realize, if I start my story with me, I start in the middle. If I start my story with God, everything changes. I'm part of a bigger story. And God would send him on a mission. He would invite him to become involved with what he was doing. He would tell Moses, this is what I'm doing, and I'm going to send you to be a part of that. And Moses' life is never the same again. You know what Moses struggles with? The same thing we all struggle with. When he starts with himself, he gets hung up on all of his inadequacies. And he has all these excuses and questions for God, all these reasons why he can't do what God is calling him to do. That's what happens when we start our story with ourselves. When we turn our eyes to ourselves, we see all of our flaws, all of the reasons why we can't. But when we start with God, all of a sudden we open ourselves up to his power. All of a sudden, it's not a question of what we can do. It's a question of what he can do. All of a sudden, it's not what is God's will for my life, but it starts with, what is God's will? Who is God? What is His will? And from that place, we come to figure out the part we play in that bigger story. I remember when I was 18, I had just graduated from high school. I had no idea what I was going to do with the rest of my life. I had a few ideas of what I didn't want to do with my life. And one of those big ones was I didn't want to be a pastor. I had nothing against pastors. My dad was a pastor. His dad was a pastor. I had a respect for it, but that was not me. I was terrified to speak in front of people, and there was a whole lot of other reasons why I figured this is not what I'm going to do, and so I didn't know what I was going to do. So I took a year at a Bible college right there in our local town, and just to really buy another year of time to figure out what direction am I going with my life. Well, one of the first weeks of that Bible college, they had what they called Spiritual Emphasis Week. And it was a week where they brought in a speaker and we had chapel every day for that whole week. Well, I was pretty busy at the time. I was working part-time. I wasn't feeling all that great as well. My health wasn't good. And so I skipped the first 3 chapels. Now, my dad happened to be the president of that seminary, so probably not the best to be one who's skipping chapel when your dad's the president, but I thought I could get away with it. So I skipped the first 3, would go home, take a nap, just trying to navigate all the busyness of my life at the time. But then that Thursday came up, and I was about to skip like I had always done. And I made it all the way to the door, and I was about halfway out the door into the parking lot where something within me just stopped me. And I can't really explain it other than I just felt like I have to stay for this chapel, even though I haven't stayed for any of the other ones. And so I turn around, I go back in, I file in the back row, and I made the mistake of not sitting on the very end of the row. I sat a little bit in, and this beautiful older lady comes in with her walker and sits on the end of the row and traps me in. I'm not gonna ask her to get up and leave, and so I settle in for chapel. Well, the speaker that day talks about the Israelites crossing the Red Sea in Exodus chapter 14, where you've got the Egyptian army coming behind them, you've got the Red Sea out in front of them, and they're trapped. They need a miracle. And they cry out to Moses, and Moses cries out to God. And God says to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the children of Israel to move forward." And when they do, the sea splits, and one of the greatest miracles ever recorded takes place. And it says when they get on the other side of the sea, they feared God. Their faith had grown on the other side of the sea. And the chapel speaker that day said, God never takes us around our fears. He always takes us through them. He sets us up for a miracle. And that day I realized God was calling me into the ministry. I was just fearful. See, I was starting my story with myself. All the inadequacies, all the things I couldn't do. I wasn't starting my story with the God who can split the Red Sea. And so I found myself up at the front praying and saying, God, I surrender my life to you. Whatever ministry looks like, whatever direction you want to take me, I am going to go where you lead. Well, the next day I came to that chapel again, and it was another great chapel. Still wasn't feeling good though, and I realized that my mom had made me a doctor's appointment because she knew I wouldn't make my own doctor's appointment. And when I went to the doctor's appointment, they tested my blood sugar. They said, your blood sugar is off the charts. We need to get you to the emergency room. And went to the emergency room, did a bunch of tests, and got the news that I was now diagnosed as a type 1 diabetic. And I remember I didn't get a room until about 2:30 in the morning. And I'm laying there, middle of the night, just the sounds and the lights of the hospital machinery around me. And at that moment, I remembered back just 24 hours earlier, where God helped me to deal with my fear. And God so clearly said to me, keep your focus on me, not on your fears, not on yourself, not on your own inadequacies. Turn your eyes towards me, and your fears will be taken care of, because I will part the Red Sea for you. And as long as you follow me, you will see miracles in your life. And you know what? I have. And so I want to ask you, where do you start your story? Do you start with yourself, or do you start with God? So in my story, I was pretty nervous to think that God would ever call me to do really a version of what we're doing now.
Yeah.
To be standing here speaking and teaching the Bible, that was what I was so worried about. But what I think we see all throughout Scripture is that every time God comes to somebody to invite them onto His agenda, they're never ready. Like they're always inadequate. They always have excuses. People like Gideon and Moses and all these guys, they always tell God why they can't. And yet I love how God always sees the potential in them of what He can do, but oftentimes He also has to get them to that point.
Yeah.
They're not there yet, but when God comes into their life, He's going to shape their character to get them to where He wants them to be.
You know, as your father, I'm just thinking of your story where we discovered you had diabetes. And as your father, I was so proud that you'd come to seminary. I was concerned about you in some ways.
Didn't see me a whole lot.
Yeah, like where are you? It's chapel. There's no sun here today. But you know, I was with you at the doctor, the hospital, when they told you you had diabetes, and as your father, I'm thinking, well, Lord, why are you doing this to my son? I mean, he's obeying you. He's in Bible college. Like, you should make the path easier. And
didn't he just come forward and,
yeah,
make the right decision, and now this?
And you know, I was as a father, I'm thinking, well, I've told my son all of his life that he can trust God and that God has a plan for his life. And then all of a sudden things get worse for you. And but looking back, we realized that God was preparing you, and that God knew what He had in store. And so much of the time, God does His best work through our trials and not through just ease. And I think that's why, as you said, you have to start with God and you have to end with God. And if you give God time, He'll work it out. And you'll look back and you realize God was in charge and in control the whole time. I remember, Mike, the first time that you spoke after that, and you were terrified. And,
oh, yeah.
And we had the opportunity for you, me, and my dad to all speak at a men's conference in Toronto.
Yeah, 3 generations.
Yeah, and it was awesome. The first time 3 generations of Black could be all speaking at the conference. My dad was the big name. I was the middle-sized name, and you were the no name.
I was the only one not wearing a tie.
And I remember that conference. You were so nervous, and Dad spoke the first night. I spoke the next day.
There's some big shoes to fill.
Yeah, you're following Henry Blackaby, and that Saturday evening, it was just you, and it was your first time to speak, and you're all nervous, and we're trying to, calm you down and everything. And I'll never forget that night. You start speaking, and you're only 17, 18 years old or so, and you're still a kid, you're still a teenager, and you start speaking, and God just moved that night. I'll never forget watching my son preaching his first sermon at an event that he'd been invited to, and about 3/4 of the way through the sermon, all of a sudden a man gets up and he just starts walking toward the front.
I thought he was going to leave. I was like, man, this is worse than I thought.
And then, but he keeps going toward the front, and he's walking toward like where you are, and I can see the nervous look on your face. Like, is he going to come up and give me a rebuttal?
Did I defend this guy?
And I remember when he gets right to the front, he falls to his knees and he just starts to pray. And all of a sudden, men start coming forward all over that auditorium, and the whole front fills up with people praying. And I remember you looking back at me, like with this look as you're talking, like, Dad, what do I do? Like, I'm not done my sermon yet. And I remember just saying, I motioned to you, just pray, invite everybody to come. And so you just said, I'm going to stop, you can come. And the all the chairs just emptied, and all these men came. And I'll never forget the next morning, we're having breakfast before the final session. And I'm sitting between my dad on one side, you on the other side. And I get finished eating, and I look to my dad. I said, hey, why don't we go and let's go get our teeth brushed before the session this morning. He thought that was a good idea. So I turned to tell you that. and there's like 6 men all waiting in line to talk to you about what you'd said the night before. No one is there to talk to me or
That's
Dad.
because you guys hadn't brushed your teeth yet.
And I remember then thinking, you know, I used to think it was so awesome what God did in my dad's life. He was the greatest man of God that I know. And then God also began to use my life, and I felt so unworthy to follow my dad and to be a part of that ministry. And then I realized, well, that wasn't the end of the story. God was working in your life now, and your brother and your sister's life, and God's work was continuing. I was just like a part of the story, just like you were. But God began a work long before us, and that work will continue long after us. We're just a part of the journey with God.
And what's amazing is it wasn't about me and my abilities, and it wasn't even about you or your dad and your abilities.
Yeah.
When you start with God and His power, He can take anybody, bring them into His agenda, into His story, and showcase His power through anybody.